Hi everybody, and welcome to Justin's session on retroductive theorizing in applied scientific realism. Just to introduce myself, my name's Dr. Kevin Harris, and I'm senior lecturer at Solent University in Southampton, UK. And the whole basis, I suppose, for today, for this evening, or in Justin's case, today's, and maybe other people's webinar, is I basically created, alongside some other colleagues, the Solent University Realist Research Group a couple of years ago. It's been formally established now for around a year, and for some time we've been really keen to try and bring together a group of researchers, evaluators, people who are interested in realist research and evaluation, to collaborate, share knowledge, share ideas, and try to deal with some of the quandaries and some of the problems that many of us have experienced in trying to grapple with things like retroduction, abduction, and the usual things that come alongside realist thinking. And for some time we've been having a series of things like coffee mornings, we do presentations, we share ideas, and we do all those sorts of things. And we've got quite a strong group of around 50 plus people. And if any of you who aren't in the group are interested in getting involved, it's not just something that's limited to Southampton in terms of Solent University. We've got a wide range of members across the whole of the world, essentially. So if anyone's interested, then please do get in touch, and I'd be delighted to get you more involved. But as part of SURRG, we were really keen to get Justin involved this year in terms of running some a training event of some sort to help people with some of the problems that they're having, or just who are interested in some of the things that Justin is going to be talking about this evening. And I read his paper on retroduction, which I thought was fantastic. I thought it was excellent, and it raised a number of questions for me, which I remember dealing with myself when I was doing my PhD. And I kind of wished that Justin had written that paper 4 years ago, because it would have been really helpful for me then. So I think that this paper that Justin has published has been long overdue, and it's a fantastic contribution to the realist community. And that's where, when I've been speaking to Justin for some time, he very kindly agreed to do this webinar for us this evening. And I'm absolutely delighted that Justin's here with us. So I won't talk for much longer because people aren't here to see me or listen to me. I'm going to hand over to Justin now and just say again, thanks very much, Justin. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much for the generous introduction, and really nice to learn about your organization, your activities, and your, continued enthusiasm and promotion of realist methodology. It's what we need. We need to continue building a community of practice. So, thank you for doing that. It's a really important aspect of developing the methodology. I will just start by saying that I first heard of the term retroduction when I attended the 2014 Critical Realism Conference. That was the first time that I heard the term retroduction. And when I heard it and I spoke to people about it, and they talked about the importance of the idea of retroduction for critical realism, it really was a concept that grabbed my attention, and it didn't leave. I was thinking about retroduction for a long time. And also I noted that Pawson and Tilley's work, Pawson and Tilley's contribution to develop scientific realism, didn't really engage with the concept of retroduction. Pawson and Tilley's realistic evaluation otherwise known as realist methodology, engages with ideas like mechanisms and ontological depth, but mainly around the idea of developing and testing program theories and middle range theories. But retroduction was not something that was an explicit term that was used by them, even though when you look at their work and the contribution they've made, it is retroductive. It is all about retroduction. So I wrote this paper with the idea of filling in a blank in the story of scientific realism, Pawson and Tilley's scientific realism, because there are many versions of scientific realism, and the history of scientific realism predates Pawson and Tilley, but Pawson and Tilley have really promoted the idea of scientific realism in a specific way, building a methodology around the evaluation of programs, policies, services, interventions. So that is how this paper came to be. It took me some time to write, talking about years. I wrote it slowly, and it's an attempt. It's not easy to convey philosophical principles around scientific methodology. It's, as you probably know from your own firsthand experience, it's not easy to convey, to explain. And so this presentation is just another potential resource for people to grasp the concepts, gain some ideas around how to articulate the realist paradigm and specifically the scientific realist paradigm, and even more specifically, retroduction in applied scientific realism. So that is what we will talk about today. I'm not going to bombard you with slides. I have 11 slides, including the title page, so that's 10 slides. And they are mainly to stimulate discussion. It's possible that the most interesting aspects of this seminar will be in the discussion that ensues. And so there are some options for you to participate. You'll see there's a chat box. And Kevin will be monitoring the chat box as the presentation unfolds. And please feel free to write in your questions, your comments to the chat box during the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. Please feel free to do that if that works for you, if you're able to follow the presentation and formulate some questions for discussion. Alternatively, you can wait until the end of the presentation and write some ideas, thoughts, comments in the chat box. And there is also the opportunity to engage with verbal exchange. So we may unmute mics and just have conversation. That will be really, really nice. I particularly enjoy doing that. So it's not just a monologue from my end, but I get to hear from other people and learn from other people, because we all have expertise in some way, and we all have interesting ways of expressing and articulating these ideas. I know many of you on the call, and it's very nice to see some familiar faces, and so I'll be looking forward to discussing, with the familiar faces, but also the new faces as well, everybody. So that's the preamble. And I think that's all I need to say for the preamble. I'm just going to get going then on the slides, and we'll take it from there. So the first point is that this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote for the Journal of Critical Realism in 2020. This year, Retroductive Theorizing in Pawson and Tilley's Applied Scientific Realism. It is there that you'll get all the details. I'm obviously not going to be able to provide all the content of the paper in this presentation. I will be, touching on some main points. So in the paper, I talk about the difference between abduction and retroduction as one example. Ontological depth, inference, sufficiency, mechanism, latency, and activation, context, mechanism, interaction, and approximation and accumulation. So essentially, I'm going to go through all of those concepts. They are a little bit dense to, on first read, but hopefully we'll have a chance to unpack all of that and create some deeper understanding of realist methodology. So the first question we may ask is, why scientific realism? Why is scientific realism a worthy pursuit? And in order to answer that question, we have to know what scientific realism is. So we may say that scientific realism is the application of realist principles to the scientific process. Not all science engages with retroduction or with realist principles, but when science does engage with realist principles, retroduction mechanisms, then we can call that scientific realism. So scientific realism is born out of a critique of scientific practice that does not account for the deeper understanding of why things are the way they are. If you're asking a question, does it work? Does something work? If it's a binary type of question, yes or no, that's not the deeper causal explanation of why things are the way they are. So that is not retroductive, and it's not really in line with scientific realism. Sometimes you need that yes or no. Sometimes you need that binary question. Does it work? Does something work or not? Or is this happening? Or are all swans white? That's a yes or no question. Sometimes you may introduce a research process with a starting question like that, but a scientific realist process goes deeper. It asks the why, and it asks how. Why is this the way it is? How is it? So another point is that scientific process relies on empirical evidence capture. That is essential to science. That's a defining feature of science. Without empirical evidence, there is no science. If you don't have evidence, if you can't collect data, you can't generate evidence, can you call that science? Not really, not in the way that we understand science. So that's one way of a very brief definition of what science is. Science involves evidence. But in scientific realism, evidence capture is one piece of the causal puzzle. It's only one piece. Empirical evidence is only one of many dimensions of our reality. So this is absolutely fundamental to the paradigm of scientific realism, is that empirical evidence is one piece of a larger view of our reality that includes aspects of our reality that evade empirical capture, that are not amenable to collection of data, for example. Now that is difficult to understand because really, for the most part, we rely on data to develop our research process, to develop methodology, and to analyze using certain constructs, for example. So to say that we are going to include in our scientific process those aspects of our reality which are evidenceable, that are amenable to evidence capture, as well as aspects of our reality that are not so easy to evidence or are not amenable to evidence capture, is a rather intriguing kind of statement, because how do you do that? And what claims can you make from incorporating aspects of reality that are not part of an evidence capture? So that's very interesting. It actually sets up scientific realism to be somewhat inherently contradictory, because the scientific part relies on evidence capture and the realistic part includes that which is beyond. So it's a very interesting paradigm to examine and to understand, to try to figure out. And many of us are still trying to figure it out. It's a lifetime of trying to figure it out. But it is worthwhile. That's the argument that it may not seem like you're walking on solid ground when you include aspects into the scientific process that are not fully and easily captured by evidence. That sounds very shaky, but it's also more in line with the nature of reality. So the closer we can approximate our scientific process to the nature of reality itself, the more aligned our outputs will be to the truth of things, is the idea. So I'm sure that generates a lot of questions, maybe is inspiring to some or is very alienating. It would be interesting to know how that strikes you. Does it make sense? Is it making sense? Does that make sense? So why scientific realism? So another way to answer that question, why would you adopt a scientific realist approach, is to think of a paradox. So the definition of a paradox is a statement or situation that may be true, but seems impossible or difficult to understand because it contains two opposite facts or characteristics. And this is often the case, that in life generally, and in the scientific process specifically, you may have data that contradict each other. And so what does that mean? Does one sort of dominate the other? Is one something that is considered false and the other considered true? How do you reconcile paradox? How do you reconcile um, opposing facts? And so this is a good place to start in your contemplation around scientific realism. If you think that there's paradox in our reality, that you can say that empirical evidence that reveals paradoxical outcomes requires that the scientific process be used to analyze phenomenon with greater depth. Okay? Accessing deeper reality, which is not always easy to evidence, resolves paradox. And so scientific realism has this concept called ontological depth, that is this idea that reality is stratified in layers and there are deeper realms to our reality. And that if you operate at a deeper realm, you will be able to resolve paradox. If you don't operate at that deeper realm, if you are adhering to empirical evidence alone, then you are just swirling in sort of a whirlwind of confusion, and which is where we are at for the most part in mainstream science. If you read the news, and the news articles today are referring back to a lot of scientific research that is currently happening to try to understand current affairs. And there's a lot of contradictory statements coming out of science. This is good, this is bad. This works, this works, but it also doesn't work. This may work, but it may not work. So there's a lot of contradictions, a lot of paradox that remains unresolved and doesn't really contribute to the resolution of complex problems. If you take something like global warming as an example, it's a very maybe it's a very coarse example, I don't know. If you take the example of global warming, and say the evidence is suggesting that the Earth is heating by a certain amount, a number of degrees per year, per decade, and scientists have been investigating this, they've been tracking this, and so they are concluding this, that the Earth is heating. Yet there are certain regions that are actually getting colder. The last number of years, the winters have been much colder than they have been in, say, the decade prior. So then the empirical evidence would seem to suggest that actually the Earth is not warming, it's actually cooling, which is a source of confusion for a lot of people. And so it seems like a paradox. How can you say the Earth is warming when it is also could be also cooling, or maybe it's cooling in certain areas where it's warming in other areas? So who wins out in this debate about what's actually happening? But if you theorize and imagine that what's happening is that the temperatures in the around the Earth's surfaces are actually getting displaced, so that if the Arctic is getting warmer, the cold air from the Arctic is actually being pushed south, so that people living in those regions where the pockets of temperature are being pushed down are experiencing colder temperatures. They are not experiencing the warmer temperatures in the places that the colder temperatures used to be. So then the evidence shows difference. But when you take a deeper look at it, you may come up with a reason why global warming is creating colder temperatures in certain places. That's an example. I mean, it's to be investigated and confirmed by experts in that field, and there are many fields, all fields actually, that have paradox. So you can think about the paradox that exists in your field and how that paradox can be resolved. In the paper, I talk about suicidal ideation, the idea that in many cases, not all, but in many cases or some cases of suicidal ideation, people who are contemplating suicide towards the moment where they take action to take their life, they may develop a sense of peace. They may have some uplifting mood. Maybe they feel joy. They feel peace. And so to a naive observer, that empirical reality would seem to mean that they are far away from a dark place, a place of contemplating taking their life, when in fact maybe they are actually closer than ever, because that feeling of peace or contentment or joy or resolve or resolution is a product of their resolve to go forward with that action. So it's a paradox in a way, because what seems to be on the surface is not actual. It's not corresponding to what actually is happening. There is a depth to that reality. So when we see somebody who is seemingly feeling good, having a good mood, uplifted, there's more to what's going on than what we see on the surface. So that's why scientific realism is important. That's why the idea of ontological depth is important, because we have to assume that what we are observing on the surface is just one part of the story. Now, hopefully, the story is a good story from the surface right down to the depths. It's a consistent story, and there's no paradox, and it all makes sense. But there's no guarantee that that is the case. And so that's what we have to keep trying to understand. Especially in the case of contradictory evidence, we need to then push deeper into our thinking, into our understanding, to come up with an explanation for that contradiction, to advance our fields. So interesting. Yeah. Okay, good. There's some questions coming in. Look forward to having Kevin help me with those at the end. So keep your thoughts coming in. And so the next concept I want to explain is ontological depth. So I've already touched on it. So you may define it as all objects of scientific investigation are ontologically deep and should be explored retroductively to avoid the skewed optics of a flat, in other words, empirical ontology. Okay, so all objects of scientific investigation are ontologically deep. We're going to assume that if you have an artifact, if you have a variable, if you have a slice, a piece of a phenomenon that you're studying, there is a depth to that phenomenon. It's not just a surface level reality. There's always a corresponding depth to anything we are looking at, and that we must examine that depth always. Otherwise, we run the risk of what I call a skewed optics of a flat ontology. And so that the example of the global warming is like an example of the skewed optics. If you're experiencing colder winters year after year, while the scientists are saying that the Earth is heating, and if the Earth is indeed heating up, then there is a skewed optics here. Something is not fully understood to the depth. So that is what ontological depth means. Science based on a flat ontology uses only that which can be observed as the basis for evidence generation. And so this is problematic. This is very problematic and very dangerous, actually. And then it can be used for political gain, political means. Science is just ripped apart then. It's not used to develop higher knowledge. It's dangerous. Flat ontology is dangerous. And the solution is a realist approach, a scientific realist approach, which I think most of you can appreciate. So ontological depth, absolutely essential. So I'll just move forward and talk about retroduction and its relationship to abduction. So there's a lot of interest in understanding retroduction and abduction. Some people may not have heard of these terms before. At least maybe you haven't heard of abduction. So just a very general definition for each. So retroduction is the activity of unearthing causal mechanisms, explaining why reality manifests in the way that it does. So anytime you ask the why question, why are things the way they are? Why has this manifested? Or how do we expect something to work? How and why, these are retroductive questions. And so what I say about the difference between retroduction and abduction, because they're very similar, and some people actually have concluded that they are synonymous. I even asked Roy Bhaskar in 2015 personally what he thought, and he thought they were more or less synonymous, but then other people in critical realism will make a distinction. So you have to understand that there are different ways to interpret and define these concepts. This is my way, so perhaps it's useful for you, or you may use it to explore other ways that are useful. Abduction is theoretical redescription based on creative, hunch-driven thinking. So there are some good references in the article, the Dänemark article on talking about theoretical redescription, and the Tavery and Timmerman's book on abduction. You can refer back to the article for those references. But generally, you can think of abduction as theoretical redescription based on creative hunch-driven thinking, whereas retroduction is the activity of unearthing causal mechanisms that explain why reality manifests. So right away, some difference there. Abduction isn't explicitly about the how or the why. Abduction is about the means to which you get to the how and the why. So in the paper, I say that abduction is more epistemological because it's about the knowledge process that is required to understand mechanisms, and retroduction is ontological in the sense that it points us to a deeper reality. It points us to ontological depth. So two sides of a coin, retroduction and abduction, are both very important. Again, abduction is not a term that is used by Pawson and Tilley explicitly, but you will find that there are many instances in realist publications, realist methodology publications, that where abduction is implicitly being used. Even if it's not explicitly described, it's implicitly being used. Creative, hunch-driven thinking leads the scientific process in searching for and testing mechanisms. So that's the relationship between the two. We need this creative hunch-driven thinking. It's not necessarily always about mechanisms or always about the underpinning, but it is creative and it's hunch-driven. And so in order to push our minds down to a deeper level of reality, we need to get creative. And sometimes we need to reframe what we're seeing in terms of outcomes, in our evaluation. We need to reframe that in a new theoretical framework. So anytime you take a concept and you reframe it in a way that helps to understand it, in a way that helps bring a more accuracy to that ontologically deep reality. That's abduction. When you think of the common use of the term abduction, and it's a very unfortunate type of meaning when, say, in the news you hear that somebody has been abducted. You know, a person has been abducted, a child has been abducted, somebody has taken somebody away, stolen somebody, kidnapped somebody. That's most often how we use the term abduction. And so I think people may assume that that's a completely different meaning, different use of the term. It has no relation to what we're talking about here. But actually, there is kind of an interesting connection, because just as the term abduction in common usage means the removal of somebody from their context, here what we're doing in scientific realism when we are developing our theories, our retroductive theories, we may be taking something, taking some bit of reality, taking it out of its existing place and replacing it in a new theoretical framework. So we're abducting the concept. It's a very coarse analogy, and a very unfortunate analogy, and maybe not a useful analogy. It's probably not very useful, but just interesting nonetheless to think of that connection. It's this idea that you may more easily be able to understand a reality if you reframe it in terms of another reality. Now, I know people are probably wondering if I could give an example would be very helpful. But, you know, say for example, you set up a health clinic and you're evaluating the service delivery model. That's a very common type of project that uses realist evaluation and evaluation of a service delivery model. Say you have a sexual health clinic for survivors of domestic abuse or sexual assault. And you have developed this center very carefully, where you have the physical layout, and also there is training, there is trauma-informed care, service delivery training for the health professionals working there. They take a lot of interest in ensuring that the space is customized to the needs of this population, but they find that actually it has a very low attendance, that actually the majority of the people that they're interested in serving actually do not end up at their clinic. They end up at their GP practice or at emergency or somewhere else. And they're wondering why. So you may come up with a theory around self-determination or candidacy. So maybe somebody doesn't feel that they are a candidate for the service because the psychological impact on, like, from an event or an experience leaves them with a very low self-worth, and so there is a lack of trust. You might find trust theories, you might find theories around self-determination that actually take this little bit of data around low uptake and reframe it in a different frame around candidacy, that somebody doesn't feel like a candidate for the program. That is different from the data itself that is just the numbers. For example, maybe there's a quantitative evidence that's showing that there is not the numbers of people that should be coming, considering the rates of incidents of traumatic events or sexual domestic violence or something, that there's not the data are showing that it's not being uptaken, for example, or it's not working. And you might then reframe that data around something like candidacy theory that helps you understand the possibility that the reason why it's not working, or the reason why there is a lack of uptake, has to do with a feeling of a lack of candidacy, a lack of feeling like I am worthy, or I'm a worthy candidate for this service, or self-determination theory around the feeling of external locus of control versus internal. That is abduction. Abduction is taking some data and replace it and reformulating that data in a different theoretical framework. It's what Dänemark and colleagues called theoretical redescription. And that process of doing that might unearth mechanisms. New mechanisms come to mind that need to be tested, but come to mind. So you see that abduction actually is happening all the time in our process, even if we don't know, especially when we incorporate middle range theories that reformulate evidence, reshape our understanding of what evidence is into a new conceptualization that helps us see more deeply. It's one thing to get numbers around uptake. That's a very flat kind of ontology, the numbers. But the why and the how may need some reformulation. So that retroductive quest to get to the why and the how may need some reformulation, and that process of reformulating is abduction. Okay, so that is one way to explain retroduction and abduction. Okay, so think about that. Let me know if that resonates or is confusing or leads to more discussion, more questions. Okay, so the next point I'm going to make is about approximation and accumulation. It's not going in order. In the paper, I have it in a certain order, but I've switched the order for this presentation because I thought it might flow better. So what do I mean by approximation and accumulation? So mechanisms typically evade empirical capture. Okay, so that's a standard kind of idea in scientific realism, is that mechanisms may not exist in a form that is easy to measure or describe. And scientific realism can scrutinize proxy equivalents to non-empirical mechanisms. So if you have a mechanism that isn't really easy to empirically derive, to empirically measure, then because you're in a scientific process, you need some evidence, right? You can't just rely on non-empirical reality alone. You need some evidence. So then the bridge is what we can call a proxy equivalent, something that is not the same thing, but can step in as, like a placeholder, something that serves as an equivalent. So proxy means, this is from the Cambridge English Dictionary, a situation, process, or activity to which another situation is compared. Proxy equivalents should be subject to ongoing testing in an accumulative approach. So this is why scientific realism, Pawson and Tilley have promoted the accumulative approach to evaluation science, because especially if you're incorporating aspects of a reality which are not easy to evidence, and you are prioritizing those aspects, then you also have to commit to a long-term view of their manifestation and the evaluation, the testing of those mechanisms, because it's not a one-off, it's not a one-time thing. It's something that we need to commit to in the long term. That's why we produce evidence-informed theories at the end of our studies in realist methodology, as opposed to facts, because we assume that maybe we haven't got it right, or maybe that we haven't captured the entirety of the reality of a circumstance. So things need to be tested on an ongoing basis. So this is the reason for accumulation. In fact, approximation is the reason for the need for accumulation. If you think of an example like, if you have a theory that your sexual health clinic, say I go back to that example, your sexual health clinic that is customized to the needs of people who are survivors of domestic abuse or sexual assault, for example, that the success of the program depends on the empathic service provision, the level of empathy that the service providers offer as a resource. So it's very difficult to measure empathy. If you are saying that empathy is what makes the difference, it's a very, very powerful, has a very powerful effect. And we can theorize that effect in more detail, although we don't really have the time to go into how that could lead to effects along a causal chain, but let's assume that it does, then we may also recognize that empathy is one of those types of examples of mechanisms that exist at a deeper level in our reality that is not so easy to evidence. So if you walk into a room and there are two people talking, can you detect that empathy is happening versus not happening? Is it something you can just observe? And if you can observe, what are you observing? Is it the number of times somebody blinks? Is it the number of times somebody smiles? Is it the way somebody smiles? Is it the way somebody turns their head to the side? Is it reaching out and touching somebody's shoulder? What is empathy at the empirical level? And this is where you can get proxy equivalents, which are not perfect, because there is also the problem of, hollow efforts, shallow efforts. Somebody may say, well, the way to develop empathy is to smile and to repeat what the person has said. But if it's not done with that true intention of connecting with a person, of the true intention of empathy, it can seem like, false efforts, something contrived, something insincere. So when you observe that, are you observing empathy as it manifests genuinely? What is the manifestation of genuine empathy versus, going through the motions of an operationalized definition of empathy? All of this kind of exploration is something that can be unpacked using a realist approach, a scientific realist approach. And proxy equivalents are also there in the mix, but we have to be careful because we have to make sure we remember that proxy equivalents are not the real thing. And this is another critique of the empirical approach. If you are only prioritizing those aspects of our reality that are empirical, then you might assume that everything is empirical. Everything can be empirical. You're not recognizing that some things are actually proxy equivalents. They're empirical proxy equivalents to things that are actually happening at a deeper level that are actually not that empirical. And to not separate those out, in other words, to conflate all of that, is very problematic. Because if you say that trust between service provider and service user is essential for uptake of service, for uptake of health beliefs or medical advice or something like that, and you try to operationalize trust, we see it time and again, a backfiring effect where somebody is thinking that they are following some guidelines to build trust, but actually the opposite is happening. Mistrust is being developed because there's not that genuine trust coming through. And that genuine aspect is that deeper aspect that is so hard to grasp and to understand. So maybe some of you know what I'm talking about, even just from firsthand experience, personal experience in life. We can rely on that kind of experience to continue to clarify principles in scientific realism. Yes. So, okay. So mechanism, latency, and activation. So how are we doing for time here? Okay. Yeah. So we're good. We got lots of time. And I only have a few more slides. So we have lots of time for going through questions, discussion. So mechanism, latency, and activation. This is another key factor, characteristic of scientific realist approach. So mechanisms have the quality of latency, and you may define latency as non-manifested existence. That can be our definition of latency here, something that exists but is not manifested, and that is a realist. It's a realist ontological view that some things are existing in our reality that are existing as potentiality or possibility. So in latent form, mechanisms exist as possibility and potentiality. In activated form, they hold some actual form that may or may not be available for empirical capture. So we're getting complex here, aren't we? It's very complex ideas. That you have latent mechanisms, and so latent mechanisms are not empirical, And you may even have activated mechanisms which are not empirical. But you might argue that, trust gets activated under certain conditions. Somebody may feel that they trust somebody. And so even then, even if somebody feels trust, it's not necessarily easily measurable or describable. But you may also say that trust is there as a possibility. So when two people converge, maybe it's service user and service provider, maybe it's community groups or community organizers or leaders or whoever it may be, you may argue that there is the potential for trust to build. Trust exists as a seed that hasn't yet germinated. And it's only through the development of a relationship between groups or individuals that the possibility of trust may germinate into actual trust, real trust, manifested trust. And so that's very interesting because it takes the idea of non-empirical reality one step further. Not only are there hidden mechanisms that are that exist, that are manifested, but there are also mechanisms that are latent. And there is one more point to be made here that might just push you off the deep end, which is that even latent mechanisms have a power. So manifested mechanisms have a power, they have a force, they are a generative force. You may argue that even latent mechanisms that have not yet come into existence in a certain circumstance, they have effects. Just the possibility of something creates an impact on our world. The possibility of violence or the possibility of peace. These things have an effect. And so it's getting very deep in the philosophical understanding of realism, but very worthwhile in contemplating because we need a deep understanding of our reality to resolve complex problems. So I look forward to your thoughts. Another important feature of scientific realism is the context mechanism interaction. And the idea is that mechanisms, they activate, but they never activate in a vacuum. They never activate completely alone. They are always activated by adequately conducive context. So if you take the analogy of a seed never germinates outside of a context of air, water, like moisture, nutrients, humidity, atmospheric conditions, sunlight, etc. All of that context is having an impact on the activation of the seed. So similarly, mechanisms are always activating in context. Now, to take that one step further, to complexify that one step further, you may say that once a mechanism is activated in a context, then it becomes the context for new mechanisms to activate. So the reality that we are born into is our context, but that reality that we are born into is comprised of pre-existing mechanisms that activated in contexts in the past. So there's a very dynamic aspect to the context mechanism interaction that needs to be understood. What is context is also mechanism. But in a given moment, if you're studying a given intervention, then you may single out certain types of mechanisms that are being triggered in certain contexts, and then understanding as time unfolds, the story evolves and things get more complex, but you might try to single out some mechanisms that are clear mechanisms in relation to context. So understanding why things are the way they are involves understanding the context mechanism relationship, and retroduction in scientific realism addresses why things are the way they are based on the mechanisms that generate phenomena and the contexts that host such mechanisms. So nothing exists in a vacuum, and science cannot operate in a vacuum either. Even the idea of a laboratory experiment where you isolate variables, that isolation is a context, and it is no less of a context than a context of an open system. It is actually as much of a context. So it's impossible to escape context. You cannot put something in a vacuum. Even the vacuum is a context. Everything is a context. That is a philosophical point that you might need to contemplate. Maybe you need to lie horizontally to contemplate it, or go for a walk and think about it, or maybe it resonates already. And if it does resonate, then you'll see that the relevance of the context mechanism interaction is absolutely fundamental to all of science, to all of our scientific understanding. And a large part of scientific process that is not realist, that is empirical, ignores context, doesn't take into account the context, or tries to control context, which is really not possible. So these are very, very important concepts. Another concept that I include in the paper is inference sufficiency. This is that when you talk about inference, you're talking about induction, deduction. So induction and deduction as standalone modes of inference, absent of retroduction, are insufficient for analyzing ontologically deep phenomena and resolving paradox. Such an approach risks creating scientific outputs that are ontologically flat. So you can look at the paper. There's some interesting definitions from Bhaskar and colleagues around retroduction as a way of overcoming the deficiencies of induction and deduction as standalone modes of inference. So a scientific realist process it involves inference that is inductive retroductive, in other words, using data to glean ontologically deep understanding causation, as well as deductive retroductive, using data to test ontologically deep understanding of causation. So induction and deduction are being used concurrently in all research processes. The question is, are they getting to an ontologically deep understanding of things? And one way to determine whether your research process or any research process is getting at the deeper questions is whether or not the research question is does have a binary answer, yes or no. Does this intervention work? Or, as I wrote in the paper, are vaccines safe? You will find papers that are trying to answer that question, are vaccines safe? Because there's a lot of controversy around it, and trying to find the definitive answer, yes or no. That is what, in realist terms, we would call deficiency of inference. Similarly, this philosophical question, are all swans white? Yes or no? This is a deficiency of inference because you can never fully answer that question. Because are you asking it for a particular time period? During the period 1900 to 1999, are all swans white? Because context is always changing. Nothing is static. So you may find that you examine the entire biosphere and find not a single example of a swan that is not white. That doesn't mean that genetic mutations may not happen in the future to create different colored swans in the future. So what is the relevance of that question if it doesn't have a bounded time frame, for example? It is this erroneous assumption that you can answer questions, yes or no, binary questions, as if they are causal laws, when in fact the empirical manifestation of all reality is manifested in context, which is also not static and always changing. So it's not possible to answer those kinds of binary questions sufficiently. So scientific realism is an antidote to that, and starts by answering questions about why. So you're not answering, are all swans white? But you might ask, why are all swans white. And there is different approaches. There's an evolutionary approach, an ecological-based theory around that. There's also genetic theory around that that can get to a more retroductive question, a retroductive answer to the question of why are all swans white? So with vaccines, are vaccines safe? I mean, you may ask, why are vaccines safe, or how are vaccines safe? And even then, it's problematic because you have many different types of vaccines manufactured in different circumstances, in different conditions, administered to many different types of people and populations. And so the question becomes less and less useful. And you'll see that a realist approach, which is about what works for whom under what circumstances, becomes much more relevant and useful for addressing these complex and sometimes even very contentious questions. So inductive and deductive cycles of research require retroduction to resolve paradox, resolve complex problems, and generate knowledge that is useful for our needs. So some concluding thoughts. Retroductive theorizing is essential for developing knowledge that leads to the resolution of complex problems. Retroduction is an antidote to ignorance, so it's the opposite of ignorance. When you ask the why question or the how question, you are truly overcoming an ignorant view, which we, let's face it, desperately need. Still, even after centuries of evolution of human thought, millennia of evolution of human thought, we are not in a place right now in our civilization, global civilization, where ignorance is eradicated. We need retroduction more than ever. And understanding the generative cause of empirical reality is the highest form of knowledge. So that's a claim I'm making. Maybe you'd like to contest that claim. But if you are trying to get to the underpinning reasons why something has manifested, you are getting to the highest form of knowledge, on a knowledge hierarchy. So I don't follow a methodological hierarchy, but I do follow a knowledge hierarchy. And I would assert that retroduction produces, not everything is successful. Not all retroductive inquiry is successful. But when it is successful, it results in the highest form of knowledge, which can result in creative thinking and innovation and the resolution of complex problems that we very much need. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention during all of that. I hope it was helpful. I hope it made sense. And Kevin, I'm just going to invite you back to the session.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Kevin.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. Very, very interesting. Extremely well explained, given the complexity of everything that you were trying to cover there in such a fluid way. So, on behalf of myself and everyone, thank you for a fantastic presentation. But in terms of there's been lots of chat going away in the chat box. I'm sure you would have seen that whilst you were presenting. I suppose just really quickly, just a quick question for me to start off with, and it'll be the only question for me because there's lots of others in here. Is it correct in my understanding, and I could be completely wrong, is that because you were saying about retroduction being more of an ontological kind of position and abduction being more of an epistemological kind of position, is it the case that abduction is kind of like a methodology, or is a way of us employing realist thinking to be able to get to that retroductive ontological depth? Is that correct? Or
I think that's a nice way of paraphrasing what I've said, in a way that I said abduction is more epistemological, and you've sort of mentioned that it's more of the methodology to get to our retroductive answers, and I think it's reasonable. I think retroduction is also part of the methodology, but the actual doing and the difficult doing, like the abduction is not the easy part. People are very drawn to the very pragmatic steps that they need to take, and the capacity for developing abductive reasoning and the confidence. I think a lot of people have capacity, but they don't believe they have the capacity, or they don't have the confidence to make those kind of leaps, to make those bold attempts at theoretical redescription, is something that we need to develop. But you might consider it, yes, as part of the methodology, sort of the lesser spoken methodology of realism.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's good to hear that I was kind of on the right lines.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm moving into the chat box now, and one of the first one that's come through, I'll start off from kind of like the beginning and go on towards the end. Is from Mary Adams, and the first one is, I presume, is kind of a comment. As an anthropologist, it makes perfect sense to me. It's like putting into words what anthropological practice analysis does, and then there's a follow-up question there from Mary. Does scientific realism promise to resolve, or does it highlight paradox? Isn't it troublesome and difficult to promise resolution always?
Yeah, well, I think both. I mean, just being able to highlight paradox is a major contribution. And yes, if we can resolve that paradox, all the more, all the better. But maybe it takes time. Maybe it's not something that is like an immediate resolution. But if we if we incorporate theories into our analysis, then we have more wiggle room, more space to explore the resolution of paradox, knowing that some of this is conjecture that needs to be scrutinized, tested. But this is definitely both resolving paradox, but just highlighting paradox in and of itself is a major contribution. And let's be clear that it's not just the domain of realist methodology that would highlight paradox. This is found in all types of research process, anthropology, also all kinds of physical sciences. But realism focuses in on these ideas around contradiction, ontological depth, paradox. So we're making these concepts explicit. The difference between proxy equivalent at an empirical level with the deeper non-empirical manifestation of a proxy equivalent, like that is made explicit in the realist approach, and that's the contribution here. Whereas in other approaches, it may be done as well, but it's not being made explicit. That's what makes realist methodology very, very exciting for me, very promising. So anyway, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. And then there's another exchange below between Julian and Mary. Julian's win, part of SURRG. Hi, Julian. We see paradoxes in health all the time. In this COVID pandemic, 76% of people in the US report wearing a face covering in a shot. The observed use is less than 30%. The contexts were not defined by the survey. Mary follows that up with, but these are percentages, not paradox in ideas, or is this what Justin means? So what are your reflections on that, Justin?
Yeah, thanks both to Julian and Mary for that contribution, because it's true that it's a contradiction in the data. And so there is a methodological challenge here in terms of self-reporting versus direct observation. That's a methodological problem. It's not necessarily a paradox in the sense of how something exists in our reality as a paradox. This is a product of research. So when you say 76% versus 30%, this is that those figures are a product of a research design, and so you may scrutinize that research design to understand its flaws, to explain the discrepancy, and that's also very, very important. It's contradictory evidence. It's not necessarily a paradox because you're not resolving that from an ontologically deep view of reality. You may be resolving that from a scrutiny of data collection methods. But then you can go deeper and say, well, is it that people are saying they're wearing masks when they're not wearing masks because of a fear of implication or something like that, or they're wearing masks for 5 seconds once they walk through a shop, and then they take it off, and so then the observing and so there's things that can be unpacked there, but it's not exactly the same as a paradox as, in terms of what I was saying earlier in the other examples, but still very, very important.
Okay, fantastic. We have another one here from Mary. Justin, why do you describe retroduction first, then we have to abduct before retroduct, or am I mistaken?
Well, I've never thought of that. It's what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I have to think about that. Yeah, they really are, two wheels of the cart. First, you have to, in order to engage with abduction in the way that is useful for scientific realism, you need to understand what retroduction is first. Otherwise, you may work on a sort of abduction without knowing, without understanding the quest for uncovering mechanisms. So I think it's kind of a minor point, like whether you start with abduction or retroduction, but maybe I'm missing something. So Mary, you may feel free to unmute your mic if there's something that you really want to share with the group that you think is important. For me, they're sort of kind of on equal footing, so I don't really put one ahead of the other. Although I see your reasoning that yes, you could think that you first need to learn how to do theoretical redescription, creative hunch-driven theorizing before you get to the underpinning mechanisms. That certainly, yeah, does make sense as well. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I think it kind of resonates with what I was saying earlier, Justin, in terms of my point about, abduction is a way that we would move towards that retroductive space to help us to get there where we want to be able to, uncover those, that depth that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another one. Here's Julian. Justin, I think you're right. Retroduction and abduction are being defined very differently from philosophical definitions. So I'm presuming, yeah, Julian, that's more of a comment, an observation, maybe, rather than a question. I'm not sure how you interpret that, Justin.
Yeah, this is the thing. I've presented a certain way of distinguishing retroduction with abduction, but if this makes you feel very inspired and you feel, oh, this is so clear and I get it, and you want to read more, once you go into the literature, you'll find that these words are really muddied and interchanged, exchanged. They're used synonymously. They're used differently from how I've used them. So it's a varied field. So I'm putting forward my suggestion for understanding these terms, and then it's to be seen in the marketplace of ideas how that fares. Maybe there are other ways that are also useful, but it is important to remember that there is many different ways that people are using retroduction and abduction.
Yeah, and that kind of follows on quite nicely to Stephen Henderson. Hi, Stephen, another member of SURRG. This is fascinating, Justin. Has anyone made links between these ideas and formal philosophical worldviews?
Well, if you read Critical Realism, yes, I think you could say that those ideas are there. They're difficult to locate, just pinpoint, page 562 of this book. It's difficult. It's very dense philosophical literature in realism and critical realism. But I think in different ways people are making these links. So I'm just one of many people trying to make links and trying to make links that are also conveyable to a wider audience, because I think a lot of the ideas in realism and scientific realism and critical realism are quite insightful and brilliant, but they're not always articulated in an accessible way. So, that's that's what I'm hoping this will do.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Stephen.
Yeah. Hi, Stephen.
I was thinking more of these things as a methodology. So, for example, if you were thinking about what possible mechanisms might be under the surface, you called it creativity and imagination. Well, I'm not very good at that. So, although I never thought of putting it in the terms, but I used to use a model by Morgan that said, today I'm going to pretend I'm a Marxist. Now, what mechanisms would a Marxist thinking produce from this problem? And tomorrow I'm going to be a humanist. So what kinds of mechanisms would emerge if I simply think about it uncritically from a humanist point of view? And the day after that, I think, was a relativist. So I'm actually going to try to destroy all the mechanisms that I just thought of because they're only meta-narratives. And after several iterations, I had a kind of population of possible explanations that I could treat seriously. So I was thinking about it from a methodological approach. There are others like Stephen Pepper's work on worldviews, and there are many others. For those of us that aren't very imaginative, I wondered if anyone had ever picked those up as methods. I'm going to mute my mic now.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I mean that labor that you described sounds worthwhile, and it's sometimes disconcerting to do this because people feel like, how do I know what to pick, what lens to choose? You know, how do I know that I'm getting it right? How do I know that I'm not just creating more tunnel vision by picking a Marxist view versus a humanist view versus a relativist view? But this is where the pragmatic goals of realist evaluation save us, and that's what Pawson especially has been emphasizing, is like the pragmatist in us needs to kind of grab hold of us before we slip into the deep end and get lost in all the possibilities of theoretical redescription. You know, not only what is getting us to ontological depth, but what is also allowing us to think about the pragmatic goals of innovation of programs and resolution of complex problems. What are the what would be useful in that along those lines? And that helps us. Otherwise, it becomes bewildering. It can become bewildering. You know, and then there is the time factor. It takes time. We have to give ourselves time. Even at the end of our current study that may only be funded for another 6 months, 18 months, however long, we know that that's not the end of the story. So that we have to get comfortable with that as well, that whatever our conclusions are, even they are evidence informed, and we've gone through that evidence scrutiny process. It's not the end of the story. And so that can help relieve some concern about whether we're choosing the right or how we're picking our, you know, our theories or worldviews or conceptualizations to practice abduction. So there are ways to alleviate concern that way and to be able to move forward in a realist project.
Great, thanks, Justin. So moving on, this is another from Mary. I'm kind of trying to make sense of some of the words. Justin, we are, I'm not sure what it says, confirming maybe that we are getting to mechanisms that means everything and nothing, like trust, relationship, desire for equity, and so on. So what do we do with these? And if you read that the same way.
Yeah, well, Mary, if you want to unmute your mic, you could re-ask the question.
I just have. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Mary. Yes.
Hello. Hi. I suppose we're getting to the point where we are getting to these what feels like fundamental aspects of relationships and of the sort of social dynamics that we're trying to explore in our project. But then what do we do with them? Because things like trust come up so often in healthcare, and they can mean they do mean everything, but in a way they feel also nothing. And it's a way of taking it beyond that, so that we're just not left with something that feels a bit trite, even though it's very important. I think you were alluding to that, but I think we're just sort of stuck in that. What do we do with those concepts now?
Well, yes, Mary, thank you for the comment, because it's very, very relevant, and it's the difference between outputs from scientific realism that are really going to advance fields and outputs that are just sort of adding more noise to the literature. It's not really adding anything. So yes, we want to go beyond just saying trust is important, because that's been said, we know that. But the specifics of how trust manifests in specific contexts, the manifestation of trust for contexts that involve, domestic abuse versus the manifestation of trust in service provision for dementia research, and how trust manifests in the police force, in the military, et cetera, et cetera. So there is contexts of trust, and that's where we need to continue to build our understanding of that specific context of how trust manifests, to develop our understanding of programs, mechanisms. So trust is just one general component of mechanisms, but it's those specifics around your specific project that we need to understand, we need to grab hold of. So that's,
thank you.
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Sorry to have so many questions.
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. And Kevin, how are you doing? Are you okay?
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
So this is one now from Rob, another of us from SURRG. But can we measure some mechanisms such as anxiety with various questionnaires and scales? Are these inadequate?
Well, that's a really good question, because there are inventories and there are scales, and yes, you can use those. You can absolutely use those, but they should also be critically appraised, and there should be some recognition of proxy equivalence for those as well. Is it the case that you can measure anxiety as anxiety, or fear as fear, or apprehension as apprehension? What happens when, say, you are studying academic community collaboration and you want to measure the level of trust between the trust that the community members have toward the academics, or the level of trust between homeless population and local police, or something around trust. And say you do that, you have an inventory around trust. There are trust inventories. And so the results show that trust is very high. It's very positive. There's a lot of trust between the group, the, say, academic and the community group. But then what does that actually mean? And is that good? Is it the case that in some circumstances, high levels of trust is actually very dangerous, because it leads people to a position of being exploited without them realizing it, because they trust? And do the inventories account for that kind of complexity? That actually some cases, low levels of trust may be beneficial, because in skepticism and a lack of trust, in certain situations, this is where people learn to develop communication skills. They learn to develop a sense of standing their own ground, ensuring that their rights are being met. But if you trust the other organization or the group, if it's just the blind trust, then are you in danger? And so do these inventories account for this? And maybe they do, maybe they don't. Even if they don't, that's not necessarily a problem, but have you theorized trust adequately so that you can interpret that inventory data appropriately? And this is what gets missed. You see a study that they use an inventory, but they're taking it very much on face value. They're assuming that a higher score on the trust inventory is good and a lower score is bad. Whereas we're talking about paradox, there's something paradoxical about the inherently paradoxical about these things as well, where in certain cases a high level of trust is actually dangerous, and a low level of trust is actually quite good. So we have to understand these things. So yes, I think you can use scales and inventories. Remember that they are proxy equivalents. You have to look at the kinds of questions that are being asked. If you're using a scale to measure social cohesion, and the question on the scale is, when was the last time you knocked on your neighbor's door to borrow an egg, or to borrow a tool to do some home repairs, as a proxy equivalent to social cohesion? So you see, there's a proxy equivalent there. You have to be clear that this is you have to scrutinize the proxy equivalent. And see if it makes sense for the specifics of the study that you are doing. So good. Okay, so that's my answer to that one. How are we doing for time, Kevin?
Well, we've got about 9 minutes left technically.
Okay.
So I'm going to move on to Gail's question now.
Okay.
If Mary's okay, because there was another question from Mary above. Hi, Justin. You may not be able to direct behaviours which generate trust, but can you examine the conditions within which trust behaviours are more likely to be generated, and then work to nurture trust through creating those conditions?
You may not be able to direct behaviors which generate trust, but you can examine the conditions within which trust behaviors are more likely. Gail, I didn't quite understand. Can you talk me through that?
Yeah, hi Justin.
Hi.
I was just I agree when you were talking about trust, and that you can't force it, you can't make people trust each other. That's what I meant by direct behaviours which generate trust. But you know, can you think about, and I think you talked a bit about this when you answered Mary's question before, can you look at the conditions which are supportive of trusting relationships? So that's what I meant by the question. And then can you, once...
Go ahead.
Sorry. And then once you've identified the conditions that are supportive of trust relationships, then work to design your program in a way that nurtures trust through creating the sorts of conditions that you see have worked to generate trust in, I suppose, in that context.
Yeah, so in a way you're saying that the conditions that generate trust are the proxy equivalents of trust, or they at least are the empirical, there's something operationalizable about those conditions. And then those conditions, at least those are empirical, those are measurable, describable. Then you put forward that intervention with the theory that these conditions will generate trust. But then the question still remains, how do you actually measure trust? You rely on self-reported measures, so people will describe their feeling of trust or lack of trust, for example. And how aware are we as individuals of our own state? That's another issue. That's another challenge in getting to this deeper understanding of reality, is that sometimes we are not always fully aware of what we're feeling at a given time. So challenging, but very, very good. I think, yeah, you're on the right track. I think it's sophisticated and it makes sense. That answers your question?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. I think if we had more time, we'd enter into longer, more interesting conversations. So yeah, Kevin, go on to the next. Who's left?
Yeah, I'm going to go on. There's quite a few more, Justin. I'm not sure how much time we've got to go through these. So shall I pick some, so people who haven't actually asked a question yet? Is that a good way to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one from Wayne. If latent mechanisms have power, are they also able to influence outcome? And if so, is it necessary to consider the potential latent mechanisms? Apologies if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, you know, that I threw something out there that is actually quite complex, and it's hard to, I would say the short answer to that question is that latent mechanisms probably do not enter into the analysis in scientific realism, because scientific realism relies on evidence. There is still some reliance on evidence. It's not the only thing, but there is some reliance on evidence. So if mechanisms haven't activated, they remain as potential, well, then you might have a theory that something, that a latent mechanism has its effects. But will you be able to test that theory? Maybe. In a certain way, maybe you will be able to test that through asking people. If, say, violence hasn't erupted, violence hasn't manifested, but there is an undercurrent, there's a threat of violence, that threat as a potential, a potentiality, that may erupt. It may erupt if the context changes, even the slight context changes, violence will erupt. So you may still be able to understand the potentiality of things and their effects, but it's not easy. It's not easy. I can't go farther than that in this moment, but Wayne, is it necessary to consider latent mechanisms? Maybe not for PhD. It's something deeper. It's quite philosophical, and for a lot of people, they need to rely on some reliable forms of evidence for their scientific realist projects. So not an easy solution, but still interesting to think about. Okay, Kevin, next question.
Yeah, Wayne will be fine with that because he successfully defended his PhD in
awesome.
January anyway.
Yeah, congratulations.
So, he's more than capable of dealing with latent mechanisms now. So, here's one from, and I apologise if I pronounce the name wrong, Arcelia.
Yes,
so apologies if I get that wrong. This is really interesting, Justin. You mentioned about open system in relation to demi-regularities of event flow. Would scientific realism see regularities as closed system or open system, or perhaps both? How would you suggest around this, please? Thank you.
It's a very big question, so it's hard to answer just in a soundbite, but you could say that in a very sort of soundbite way, that scientific realism doesn't really believe in the idea of a closed system. Although you look at Bhaskar's work, he talks about closed versus open systems. Ray Pawson rejects this notion of closed versus open in a sense where it's that going back to that idea that nothing exists in a vacuum. And even if you put something in a vacuum, then the vacuum itself is the context. So that is a realist way of thinking, that context is always manifesting. So how would you work around the open system? Would scientific realism see regularities as closed system or open system? That's hard to get into, Arcelia. I think I would just have to leave it as saying that scientific realism rejects the idea of regularities and the idea of a closed system, embraces the idea of a demi-regularity and the idea that everything exists in a context. So everything has a system. Even a controlled system is still in a context. So this idea of closed versus open has less relevance for realist methodology. Okay.
Great.
Really good question.
That's a very good response in such a short period of time. Thanks, Justin. The next one is more of a comment from Stephen. You've clearly got him thinking there. You've challenged him on a number of levels, which is fantastic.
Okay, we'll go to Gareth. Let's just say we'll do Gareth, Joanne, and Steve. So we have 3 more questions. We are going to go over, but I'll try to keep it fairly short.
That's fine. So huge thanks, Justin and Kevin. Do you have any thoughts on what makes better or worse, brackets, crude terms, abductive and retroductive thinking?
Yeah, that's also a great question. How do you assess the quality of your retroductive thinking? It emerges over time. I think that you have to try it. Certainly, if you write an if-then statement, as many people do, and they try to make your if-then statement retroductive, it's not always retroductive. Some if-then statements are not at all retroductive, they are associative. So if your causal statement is associative in nature, so if people take this service, then they will get better. That's not retroductive. But if you add because, you get to the underlying cause of things. So the better you articulate your theory around the underlying cause of why something is happening, the better you will be. Your better quality will be your retroductive statement. And abduction is even more difficult to really pin down and describe as across a quality criteria because it's creative. So how do you measure something that's how do you judge a creative thought? And maybe we shouldn't judge. Maybe there's a certain realm of scientific process that involves creativity that should be left unjudged because people need to experiment with different ideas, even if it doesn't go anywhere. 99 times out of 100 doesn't go anywhere, but that one time, it's a game changer, and it changes, the way a whole discipline looks at a certain phenomenon that opens up new possibilities. So it's hard to really judge the quality of abduction. Certainly retroduction has to have the explanatory cause. It can't be correlational or associative. It has to be explanatory. So I'll leave it at that for now. And then, yeah, Kevin, who's next? Joanne?
Yeah, Joanne, Justin, I've struggled over the last few years in order to understand retroduction at a very simple level then. Is the quest to uncover hidden mechanisms, which makes me question why did I not get this before I read your paper, or is this just one approach to the understanding?
Yeah, I would say that that's in a nutshell. It is the approach to uncover hidden mechanisms. So you're going below, behind, underneath the observed reality to get to the deeper understanding of things. Is it just one approach to the understanding? Possibly. That's why you can consult the literature with a really sort of specific kind of focused attention on the definition, how people are defining retroduction, and find out how different people describe it. Different people describe it in different ways. But if you adhere to ontological depth and underpinning mechanisms, and retroduction as a definition fits in well with that. Okay,
Lovely.
next question.
This is the last one. This
Okay.
is from Steve.
Steve, yeah.
Could you not argue that anxiety is a description of an observable event, a person who is anxious? The individual can describe their own scale of anxiety, but what is interesting from a scientific realist understanding is producing explanations of the mechanisms that are generating the observable and measurable anxiety.
Well, what is anxiety? Is it perspiration? Is it a change in the rate of respiration? Is it a change in the movement of the eyes? Is it a change in the voice and the inflection? Is it a nervous system response? What is anxiety? And are all those things that I just described proxy equivalents to something that is much deeper, that is not measurable per se? That is a philosophical question that we can continue to explore, but I would argue that this is the reality, that something like anxiety is amorphous. It's difficult to pin down exactly, and that there are, byproducts of anxiety that we may be able to observe. And yeah, from a person's self-reporting of anxiety, even self-reporting anxiety, people have some purchase on their experience and they can describe it. But you may argue, purely from an ontological perspective, that anxiety as a phenomenon, it still exists as something that may be independent from the symptoms of anxiety. So, that's interesting. I mean, we have to think about that. I'll leave it at that, just because we're at time. So I'll leave it at that. I know that all these questions are brilliant, and we could spend a lot of time unpacking these things, and maybe hopefully we'll have another opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I think so. And Justin, I'd just like to say thank you again so much for giving your time to us this evening, this morning, whatever time people may be in at the moment. It's been fantastic. It's been insightful. I think the volume of the questions is clearly indicating that this is a real important topic for us to explore. I think there's definitely justification for more of these types of events, to move forward, because it is something that's so important, in terms of how we grapple with realist methodology and realist evaluation, synthesis, and so on. So thank you so much again, Justin, and I don't know if there's any final remarks you'd like to say.
No, just thank you for the invitation, and it was a pleasure to be here and to speak to everybody and to receive the questions and the discussion. So yeah, keep going, everybody. Keep thinking, and I look forward to speaking again to you all in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Justin.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Okay, signing off now.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.